Hi, and good morning. I am Teresa Albano, a co-editor of peoplesworld.org and your host for this Google Hangout called Gaza Ceasefire, Now What? After a brutal and lopsided war with more than 1,800 Palestinians killed, including 300 children, and 64 Israeli soldiers, many wonder, is Israel-Palestinian peace possible? Today, People's World warmly welcomes Uri Weltmann, a peace activist from Israel, to help us understand what it is going to take to win a just peace. Uri was one of the organizers of a national peace demonstration of Jewish and Arab Israelis in the midst of the war in his hometown of Haifa. He is a leader of the Communist Party of Israel, a member of its Central Committee, and a teacher. Uri wrote, "Upon the fire of war they pour gasoline," for the Israeli daily Haaretz, translated and republished on peoplesworld.org. Uri also has an analysis, The Long Road to Gaza, available in English on the Communist Party of Israel's website, which is maki.org.il/en. If you haven't already, I hope you read both of these fine pieces. The Communist Party of Israel has a long track record in the peace movement, working to end the occupation of Palestinian lands and pushing for a viable two-state solution, Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace and security. I would also like to welcome Susan Webb, my colleague and co-editor of peoplesworld.org. Susan has written extensively on the Israel-Palestinian conflict, /en. With her most recent piece, already, I hope you read both of these, exposing the Israeli government of Benjamin Netanyahu, shamefully lying and manipulating the kidnapping and deaths of 3 Israeli teens in order to provoke a crisis with the unity government between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. Susan traveled to Israel and the West Bank and represented the Communist Party USA at the Congress of the Communist Party of Israel. Viewers, you can type in questions into the chat function, and Susan is going to start this conversation off with Uri, and they will be answering your questions later in this broadcast. So Sue, please.
Well, it's really a pleasure and a special honor for us to be here with Uri, all the way from the other side of the world in Haifa, Israel. I'm just going to start by asking you, Uri, to tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, how you came to be an Israeli communist.
First of all, thank you for having me. And I'd like to thank all the viewers who got up so early in the morning to discuss the politics of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Like Terry said, my name is Uri Weltmann. I'm 30 years old. I work as a teacher, and I'm a member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Israel. I started my process of politicization and radicalization when I was a teenager, at my youth. In Israel, we have a television channel, which I think it's a bit like the American C-SPAN, in which you can see the debates that are going on in the Knesset, the Israeli parliament. And in the 1990s, the Communist Party of Israel had some remarkable members of Knesset, members of parliament, who delivered brilliant speeches, advocated very progressive and important laws. And watching the deliberations of the parliament over television got me quite supportive of the party. And when I came to be a university student after my high school years, then I joined the local student club of the Young Communist League, became an organizer for the YCL of Israel, and afterwards a member of the party also. And like you said, I live in Haifa, which is the 3rd biggest city in Israel after Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. It's located in the northern part of the country, and it's a working class city with a large industrial base, a manufacturing, railroad. We have the biggest seaport in Israel, the marine port in Israel, and it has been an industrial center for more than a century.
How did your family come to be Israeli?
My parents immigrated to Israel from Romania in Eastern Europe in the early 1980s, and I was born here, born Israeli. And I think they immigrated because, like many immigrants, they were seeking better life, and being Jewish, they were granted automatic citizenship in the state of Israel. I imagine that perhaps they would have immigrated to other country rather than Israel had they been provided with automatic granting of citizenship. But Israel has this immigration policy, and this had brought them here, and I was born.
Okay, thank you. Well, there are a lot of different kinds of Israelis, and with different stories. There are Jewish Israelis, there are Arab Israelis, there are Israeli Jews from all kinds of backgrounds. In this country, in the recent crisis, there have been photos circulating showing Jewish Israelis in the south of your country sitting in lawn chairs watching the Israeli airstrikes on Gaza and cheering. How representative is this of the Israeli mood, Israeli public opinion? And has it changed? Has the crisis changed Israeli public opinion in any way? Maybe you could comment on that.
Well, those images that you refer to are, of course, a more extreme and a more terrifying form of the nationalist sentiment that has been on the rise in Israel ever since the beginning of this recent wave of escalation that began in the middle of June with the kidnapping of the 3 Israeli teens. And this national sentiment brought to the fore a lot of negative aspects in Israeli society. We have seen a rise in racist attacks towards Arab-Palestinian citizens of Israel. Like you mentioned, Israel is not comprised only of Jewish citizens. About 20% of the Israeli population are Arab Palestinians who are nominally equal citizens, although in fact they are being discriminated against in various ways. And I'm referring here only to those Arab Palestinians who are citizens of Israel. Of course, there are the Arab Palestinians in the occupied territories, the West Bank and Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem, which don't have Israeli citizenship. So in the past month or so, we have seen a rise of racist attacks towards Arabs. We have seen intolerance towards criticism. We have seen attacks on human rights organizations and on peace demonstrations. And this is not racism from below. It is orchestrated from above. Members of the Knesset, of the Israeli parliament, as well as government ministers, have used their position in order to incite and to stir violence against the left wing in general, against the peace organizations and human rights organizations, and also against the Arab Palestinian minority within Israel. It is orchestrated from above. You can see in, day out, anti-democratic or racist sentiments, statements by the Israeli leadership, and this is one of the forces that is shaping society. Not the only force, of course. The left wing, the peace movement, have been trying to counter this anti-democratic measures and this anti-democratic tide, and this wave of racism. And we have seen demonstrations and rallies and conferences aimed at building unity between Jews and Arabs inside the state of Israel and turning back the wave of racism. But it is a problem, and it has been on the rise in this recent wave of escalation.
We saw that there was a very large demonstration in Tel Aviv last week of about 7,000 participants, as reported in a major newspaper like Haaretz, and that would be equivalent, given your population of Israel, which I think is around 8 million, it would be 7 million. So it would be equivalent to a very massive demonstration in the United States of maybe 250,000 compared to our population or more. So does that indicate some kind of a growing movement, and the photos looked like there were a lot of young people. What does that indicate? And it got pretty good coverage too. What does that does that offer some kind of positive sign even amidst the negative?
Definitely so. You are correct to state that there were many young people joining that protest, both Jewish and Arab young people, and it's come to show that the Israeli society is not as homogeneous that might be seen from looking at international news, at the television at the United States, or from looking solely at how the Israeli government ministers are talking and expressing. Israeli society is a diverse society. It's a heterogeneous society. It has its working class and its bourgeois class. It has its left wing and right wing. It's progressive and it's reactionaries. And the demonstration in the Rabin Square at the center of Tel Aviv less than 2 weeks ago, on July 26th, have been a massive mobilization of the progressive Israel, of the peace-loving forces within Israel, both Jews and Arabs. It had filled us with a lot of optimism. It had won a lot of media coverage, and it has expressed a sentiment of many Israelis who are disagreeing with the policies that the Netanyahu government is pursuing, that are critical towards the explanation that he's giving, and that are wishing for Israel to go on an entirely different course. Peace with its neighboring countries rather than perpetual war and perpetual occupation, and equality within Israeli society, equality between Arabs and Jews, rather than institutionalized discrimination and increasing racism. In the midst of the very deep darkness that we are in, there are a lot of light hands that are hitting for the light switch, and this is an encouraging sign.
So given the overall negative trends and the role of the Israeli government that you've described, is a two-state solution, is the two-state solution still a viable alternative, or a viable, is it a solution that's viable now? Or some are saying the two-state solution is dead. Is it viable, and how, given the circumstances that we see now, how can it be achieved? Or how can any solution be achieved? And is there any other alternative to the two? Some people say it's dead. Is there? Well, if it's dead, then is there any other alternative? And if it's not dead, how can it be achieved, in your view?
Every 2 or 3 years or so, somebody comes and proclaims the two-state solution as being dead. It has been a recurring theme in the past years. People are despairing because the struggle against the occupation has been going on for many decades, and people are looking at the horrific crimes that are being committed against the Palestinian people by the Israeli government, and from that feeling of despair comes the notion that a two-state solution is dead, and we are stuck perhaps in a perpetual situation of occupation. But if we look at the situation right now, some advocate the so-called one-state solution as an alternative to the two-state solution. If you look at the situation right now in Israel and Palestine, we have a one-state reality. Israel is the sole country, the sole state that controls all of the territory and all of the population between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. Both the sovereign state of Israel, and also is in control of the West Bank, of East Jerusalem, and in a sense also of Gaza Strip. So those that put forward the idea of one-state solution need to explain how will their model, how will their idea will be differing from the situation that we have on the grounds right now. We have a situation in which the majority of Palestinians are oppressed because they cannot express their right to national self-determination. They are expressed also economically because the GDP in the occupied territories is far lesser than that inside Israel. The Palestinian workers who work inside Israel are being exploited, and within the occupied territories there's a high percent of unemployment. There's practically no independent Palestinian economy that had developed in the past few years, not before the Oslo Accords in 1993, and also not in the 20 years that have passed since. So if we say now, let's have a one-state solution tomorrow, let's have a singular state comprising of all the Israelis and the Palestinians who live in this country, we will actually have what we have now. We will have a state in which people will be oppressed both nationally and economically, and we'll have a state that within it tries to deal with all the contradictions that arose because of the many years of the national conflict, of the occupation. The two-state solution is a possibility to end this crisis. Not the reason for the crisis. It is not the reason for the crisis, but it is a possibility to end it. We have a large percentage inside Israeli society that supports a Palestinian state established alongside Israel. In a public opinion poll that was conducted a year ago, just before the negotiations between Israel and the PLO were resumed, 59% of Israelis supported resuming the talks, and 55% supported the establishment of an independent Palestinian state. There is a Jerusalem-based media center called JMCC that publishes public opinion polls about how do Palestinians in the occupied territories view different political questions. It had been doing so for many years, and it has archives that go way back. It's available online. I encourage our viewers to take a look, JMCC. And in it, we find that despite the occupation, despite the periodic waves of violence, despite the escalation, despite the death and the terror that the occupation brings on the Palestinian people, there still is a strong percentage, a strong majority within the Palestinian people in the occupied territories that support negotiations with Israel and support the establishment of a Palestinian state alongside Israel. And not only among Israelis and Palestinians do we have a majority that supports the two-state solution, but it has also become the international consensus. We have UN resolutions, we have governments, also nominally the US government, as well as the EU, the European Union, that press for this solution to be met. And this is quite an achievement, because if we look back historically, mere 25 years ago, practically no one was speaking seriously about the two-state solution, about a Palestinian state alongside Israel. In the late 1980s, for example, those parties, political parties in Israel that are left of center, for example, the Labour Party, which for many years have been leading the so-called peace camp or left wing in Israel, it had not supported neither negotiations with the PLO nor establishing an independent Palestinian state. But in the past 25 years, there has been such a tremendous breakthrough that the majority of Israelis once did not support evacuating settlements, dismantling settlements, now in support of such a thing. In the past, we had a law that says that meeting with the PLO was illegal. Now, government ministers from right-wing parties, not only left-wing parties, meet with the PLO. So much progress has been made in the past 25 years, and this progress forms a basis for optimism that further progress can be met.
Well, it's good to hear that. I think we need a little dose of optimism because this news is so grim. Now, one of our viewers has asked the question, which I think is relevant here. He asks, what is the potential to defeat Netanyahu and the right-wing parties in the elections and to elect a coalition of pro-peace parties?
It's a good question. The Israeli political system is a multi-party system. We have a plurality of parties represented in the Knesset, in the Israeli parliament, and for a person to become prime minister, he needs to have the backing of different parties that form a majority within the Knesset. Unlike the presidential system in the US, where people vote for a certain candidate, here people vote for a certain party, and an alignment of parties behind the candidate is needed for him to become prime minister. Netanyahu is standing on shaky grounds because he's being threatened by the right wing and not only by the left wing. We have extremist parties that have grown in recent public opinion polls following the escalation in Gaza, and they have grown in a certain sense at the expense of Likud, at the expense of Netanyahu's party. This means that there might be a possibility that in the next elections, in the next parliamentary elections, his party would diminish in size with more extremist parties growing at his right. These parties, it is not at all inconceivable that these right-wing parties will not be able to form a coalition within themselves, and this puts forward the option of a center or left of center, a coalition of parties. The Labour Party has been steady in public opinion polls, but Meretz, which is a left social democratic party that stands at the left of the Labour Party, has grown even dramatically. At some recent public opinion polls, they have doubled their size. So it's not at all inconceivable that there is a possibility that those parties at the center and the left of center within themselves can have a majority. Mind you, the Communist Party of Israel, which participates in the elections as part of a broad coalition called the Democratic Front for Peace and Equality, has never been a member of the ruling coalition. Even during the early 1990s, during the premiership of Rabin, Yitzhak Rabin from the Labour Party, we have been supporting his coalition from the outside without being actual part of the government. And we have always said, and we said so also before the last Knesset elections, that we will be responsible, we are a responsible party, we will not give hand to a right-wing coalition. If a center or left of center coalition is possible, it will win our support from the outside as an alternative to a right-wing party. So the burden of proof now lies on those parties such as Labour Party and the centrist parties, whether they are willing to consider themselves to be an alternative to the Likud. Or will they, after the elections, crawl into Netanyahu's coalition for some positions in his government, like centrist parties have done following last election? And this is a political question that is still open, and it will be determined by the course of the struggle, by the course of the political development in the coming months and a year or two until the elections.
So, what is the status now of your party, the Israeli Communist Party, in light of this? I guess it's an upsurge or an increase in participation, for example, in some of these demonstrations, and the attention, that new attention that's been drawn to your party. What is its status now, and how do you see it playing a role in helping to push those center and left parties to take a more proactive stand and perhaps be a real opposition that can win?
Uri, before you answer that, let me just break in here. I just want to remind our viewers who've maybe just recently joined us that we're listening to Uri Weltmann from Israel, a peace activist and a leader of the Communist Party of Israel, and Susan Webb, a co-editor of peoplesworld.org. And also, viewers, please, some of you have already started typing in your questions and your remarks, but please do so, and we will continue to ask and get answers to those questions. Thank you.
Well, you've mentioned earlier the big peace mobilization that we had on July 26th in the center of Tel Aviv. This was organized by a coalition of groups. Some of them are joint Israeli-Palestinian peace organizations. Some of them are veteran peace movement. But the only political party that was represented there as a political party was the Communist Party of Israel, along with our partners in Hadash, the Democratic Front for Peace and Equality. This Saturday, just a few days from now, there will be another peace demonstration in Rabin Square, this time with the participation of forces that didn't took to the streets during the actual war in Gaza. Meretz party, which is, like I said before, a left social democratic party, will be participating in that demonstration. Peace Now, which is one of the oldest peace movements in Israel, that in the 80s was very powerful during the Lebanon War, will also participate in this demonstration. We are both critical of their participation, but also hopeful. Critical because it's very easy to be against the war after the war is finished or before the war started. It's the most important to be against the war while it is waging. And this is a test that both Peace Now as a peace movement and Meretz as a political party failed at because they did not mobilize during the war. But we are not only critical of their participation, but also hopeful. Hopeful that this signals the beginning of a period in which people who are disillusioned with what Netanyahu is trying to sell to the Israeli public, who are disagreeing with the course that he is taking Israel to, and who see through his lies and see through his deception and disregard the analysis that he presents before the Israeli public, will be willing to demonstrate, will be willing to mobilize, will be willing to voice their voices of opposition. And this is important in shaping the political dynamic of the country so that it will not speak in one voice, will not be homogeneous, and that it will be critical towards the course that we are going to, as well as able to point towards a different course that we need to go to.
The issue of the rockets fired into Israel is a very emotionally laden one, and invokes a lot of emotion among American Jewish supporters of Israel, and I assume within Israel too. It's a very difficult issue. How does your party respond to the issue of the rockets fired and some other you might call provocative actions coming from Hamas? At the same time, there's a need to support talks with all parties on the Palestinian side. Anyway, how does your party deal with this issue of the rockets, its impact on the Israeli public, and in relation to what's needed to move forward to a solution?
Well, you are correct to point out that the rocket attacks on Israel indeed had an impact on the public opinion here, creating fear, driving people to coalesce behind the government policies, and to portray Hamas as the government wants to portray it, as a non-partner, as a side that one cannot reason with, cannot negotiate with, and cannot reach agreement with. The rocket attacks have killed 3 citizens in Israel, and these 3 lives are added to the more than 60 Israeli soldiers who have died during this recent escalation, and to the close to 1,900 Palestinians that have died in the Gaza Strip during this very barbarous war. It's worth mentioning that the majority of those Palestinians who are killed in the Gaza Strip are citizens, are non-combatants, and this is even according to the data released by the Israeli army, which said that admitted that more than half of those killed are citizens and not involved in fighting. According to UN data, it's more close to 80% of those who died that are non-combatants. This includes many children and women and elderly. This is added to the fact that around a quarter of the population of the Gaza Strip was displaced because of the war. There was massive damage to houses and infrastructure. There are entire neighborhoods that are wiped out, and people now, those who survived the attacks, have nowhere to return to. Water is scarce, medical supplies are needed, and electricity can only have it for 2 hours a day at several parts of the Gaza Strip. So we are talking about a huge humanitarian crisis, and we are talking about a huge cost that the Palestinian population paid during this war. The Communist Party of Israel opposes targeting civilians. We say that civilians need to be put out of the cycle of violence, and this includes all civilians, Israelis and Palestinians. At the same time, we point to the need to negotiations between the different sides. We look upon the Palestinian National Consensus Government, which was formed at late April, as an opportunity for peace. For quite some years, there has been an internal division within the Palestinian political leadership, with Hamas party ruling in the Gaza Strip, and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank ruled by the Fatah party. At the end of April, as the 9 months of negotiations between Israel and the PLO collapsed, One of the developments was the formation of this new Palestinian National Consensus Government, which for the first time since many years had united politically the two most important political factions, political parties within the Palestinian people. Netanyahu, rather than seeing this as an opportunity to negotiate and to talk with a representative organ, a representative voice for the entire Palestinian people, have, on the contrary, said that because because Hamas is deemed illegitimate in his eyes, therefore these talks need to be boycotted. Therefore, this government need to be boycotted. And actually, the Israeli government has discussed within itself to put sanctions on the Palestinian Authority because of the formation of this new government. What we are calling for now is not only for the ceasefire, the temporary ceasefire that was reached in the past few days to be extended, but also for Israel to hold discussions with the Palestinian National Consensus Government. The Palestinian National Consensus Government can be a partner for negotiations. One of the founding blocks, one of the points of unity around which this government was formed was the recognition of all previous diplomatic agreements that were signed between the Palestinians and Israel. This means that Hamas, as one of the participants in this government, has agreed de facto to recognize the agreements that have been signed between the two sides and to participate in peace talks. The burden of proof now lies at the shoulders of the Israeli government. It needs to show that it is a partner for peace, that it is willing to negotiate for a serious diplomatic solution with the Palestinians. And up until now, the record of the Israeli government in its seriousness and its determination to go towards the two-state solution, towards ending the occupation, has been very bleak. For example, the Minister of the Economy, Naftali Bennett, who is the head of an extremist party called the Jewish Home, which is part of Netanyahu's coalition, said in a close conversation that was leaked to the press that the goal is to torpedo any agreement and prevent deterioration, this is his words, to pre-1967 lines. And these are words that are not said from some radical extremist on the margins. It is said by a leader of a party which is part of the coalition. And similar statements you can find within members of Knesset from Netanyahu's own Likud party. Therefore, we think that there exists a partner for peace on the Palestinian side. Now the burden of proof lies on the shoulders of the Israeli government to show that it is also a partner for such talks.
So we've touched on the movements, the political dynamics within Israel, and the prospects for a progressive trend to emerge and possibly even for a peace majority. Some of our viewers want to know about the international side of things, in particular the role of the United States. One of our viewers says, shouldn't our main focus be to convince the American public to demand no more aid to Israel, no more technology, no more weapons? Isn't this the most effective way? Well, and then another viewer wants to know about the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. Well, obviously you're dealing with Israeli politics and so on, but what would help? From the American side, what would help the dynamics, move the dynamics in Israel in a positive direction towards a peaceful solution? And what's your view on some of these things that have been raised by our viewers?
Well, it is correctly stated that Israel is the biggest beneficiary of U.S. military aid in the world, especially considering its small size and small population. Between 2009 and 2018, Israel is scheduled to receive $30 billion worth of military aid. And a large part of the weaponry that was launched against Gaza in the recent escalation originated from the U.S. Therefore, if the peace movement in the US would struggle to end military aid to Israel, to end the funding of the war machine that is oppressing the Palestinian people, it will contribute greatly to the cause of peace in the Middle East. This is also a demand that's being raised by peace movements throughout the world. A few days ago, I saw the pictures from Greece, where the Communist Party of Greece has been organizing quite strong marches around the demand to break the military cooperation between the Greek government and the Israeli government, between the Greek army and the Israeli army that are holding joint military maneuvers. I think that any pressure that is being put to isolate Israel in the military sense, to break down military ties and military connection between various armies and government, and the Israeli army, which is an occupying army, is a progressive step forward. Regarding the question of boycott and divestment, which is also connected to what I just mentioned, one of the reasons why the Israeli government was felt forced to return to the negotiating table a year ago, in July 2013, was the fact that the EU, the European Union, had pursued new policy towards the Israeli companies and Israeli institutions that are located in the settlements, in the Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem. The EU had a new scientific cooperation agreement drafted called Horizon 2020 that was due to be signed between the EU and Israel. One of the clauses in this scientific cooperation agreement said that no money will be allocated to companies or institutions that are located beyond the so-called Green Line border, the internationally recognized border of Israel pre-1967 war. This had stirred an intense debate within Israel about the question of the settlements, about the price that Israeli society is paying for continually maintaining the settlement project. People were saying, why do Israeli universities need to suffer because the government constructs new settlements and new commercial companies in the occupied territories? Suddenly, Israeli newspapers were discussing whether this certain manufacturing plant is located 200 meters to this side or to the other side of the Green Line border. This is a really healthy development, considering that the Israeli government has been pursuing a policy of wiping out the Green Line border from the maps. In fact, if you buy a map of Israel, inside Israel, you would not find the Green Line border marked on it. It tried to portray as if the West Bank and Israel, as if West Jerusalem and East Jerusalem is more of the same, it's just the same. So this discussion that was triggered by the decision of the EU to divest from the settlements was actually very constructive in the fact that it put the price of the occupation, the settlement project, and the Green Line border back into discussion. The EU was also drafting new regulations about labeling products that are manufactured within the settlements, labeling them as such, thus making a demarcation between what is the sovereign state of Israel on the one hand and what is the illegal settlement project, which is illegal according to international law and not recognized by any other state other than Israel. So I think that pursuing these policies will be very constructive, both in the fact that they can generate discussion around this issue in Israeli society, and both in the sense that it will put pressure where it hurts, on the settlement project and on the military cooperation between Israel and other governments.
How do you see cultural and academic boycotts? Do you consider them also as part of this positive pressure, or do you see a distinction there? How do you see those?
It's an interesting question, interesting and complex question. I think that one needs to distinguish as much as possible, because it might be difficult, between the sovereign state of Israel, which lies in internationally recognized borders and is a fact that is not going to be to disappear into air, and the settlement project, those that are constructed beyond the Green Line border in the occupied Palestinian territories, and which form actually the direct military oppression of the Palestinians. The settlements are constructed on the most fertile agricultural land in the West Bank. They control the most important roads in the West Bank. They control the water resources. And because the whole system of checkpoints and separated roads that is being constructed by the Israeli government in order to facilitate this settlement project, the West Bank is actually torn to a lot of different enclaves without territorial continuity. And this forms one of the greatest bases of oppression for Palestinians in the West Bank. Imagine a Palestinian who lives in a village that wants to travel to the nearby village that is only 5 minutes away by car, but he has to go around at a different road because there is a settlement in the middle and to drive through checkpoints. And this might take several hours, what could have taken several minutes. It forms one of the most daily, day-to-day form of oppression that Palestinians face because of the occupation. It is hurting their ability to have an independent, viable economy. It is hurting the ability of students to go to their schools and universities. It is affecting the people who are in need of medical care because it is difficult for them to reach health clinic and hospitals. Therefore, I think that by putting the focus on the settlement project, which is the spearhead of the occupation project, and it forms the most blatant day-to-day oppression of Palestinians, we would be pursuing the most constructive way to put our weight towards a peaceful resolution of the conflict and towards ending the occupation. The question of boycotting academic institutions or boycotting cultural institutions, in a way, it mimics what the Israeli government is doing, because the Israeli government tries to make the Green Line border disappear from the map. And those forms of boycott that don't make the distinction between the illegal settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories, all of them are illegal according to international law, and the sovereign state of Israel is in a way mimicking what the Israeli government is doing, but from the left. It also helps to conceal the Green Line border, to conceal the distinction between the internationally recognized state of Israel and the illegal form of occupation and settlement that is pursuing in Palestinian territories. I think that this question should be weighed according to the conditions in every country. I don't think that me standing here in Haifa in Israel can put out a recipe for peace movements around the world. The various forms of boycott or divestment are helpful, not necessarily in the effect that they have on the Israeli economy, because I cannot tell of a very concrete effect that this movement had so far on the Israeli economy. The biggest effect that these forms of divestment and boycott do is to create discussion among the different public opinions in different countries, in the US, in Britain, in Europe, in Latin America, create discussion about the occupation, the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territory, raise awareness to the oppression and human rights violations that Palestinians face. And so the question needs to be weighted about what is the best way to raise awareness and what is the best way to create public discussion about the occupation. If boycotting an Israeli singer that goes to a festival is the best way, then perhaps in a certain context it should be pursued. If petitioning the government on campuses and on the streets to drop military cooperation with the Israeli government is the best way to raise the awareness, then perhaps this tactic should be pursued. But regardless of what is the tactic that is being taken, I think that it is important to think out how not to play into the Israeli government hands, because by pursuing such tactics in the peace movement, that the Israeli government would label them as disregarding the right of Israel to exist and so on, we will play into their hands. So tactics need to be weighted objectively and need to be weighted according to the conditions.
That's very interesting, and it leads me to ask, how do you see the future of Israel if a two-state solution or a peace settlement were reached? How would that affect Israeli development going forward? Issues of democracy and the nature of the nature of the Israeli state is disputed within Israel as well as outside of it. So how do you think that, what future do you see? How do you see things developing going forward should a peace settlement be reached?
It's a very interesting question, a bit far-reaching question also. Without engaging in science fiction or in imagining a future that, at least at the point, seems to lie very far, I will say that any development within the context of solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will have deep-going effects on the character of Israeli society and vice versa, because the two things are interconnected in an inseparable way. First, let me start by saying, what do I mean by a peaceful solution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Peace is a word that is often thrown around in Israeli context. Almost all Israeli politicians say that they are for peace. But of course, the kind of peace that they imagine is very different from the kind of peace that the Communist Party of Israel imagines. When we are speaking about peace, we are talking about an independent Palestinian state alongside the state of Israel, across the Green Line internationally recognized borders, with East Jerusalem being the capital of the Palestinian state and West Jerusalem being the capital of Israel. We are talking about dismantling all Israeli settlements in the occupied territories, as well as dismantling the so-called separation wall that Israel has been constructing for the past 12 years, that is annexing Palestinian land and harming the fabric of Palestinian society. We are talking about solving the problem of Palestinian refugees according to UN resolutions, and we are talking about releasing all those Palestinian prisoners who are held inside Israeli jails. This peace program that the Communist Party of Israel has been pursuing for many years forms the basis of what would be a just Israeli-Palestinian peace. Peace which is both just and viable and realistic, and also in accordance with international law and international consensus and international resolutions by the UN and different bodies. But that is not to say that the character of Israel would not be changed as we are struggling for this peace program. I think that these two processes are interconnected. Israeli society needs to change in order to facilitate this kind of peace program that I've outlined, and the struggle towards this peace program would help to change Israeli society. Israeli society, I said earlier that about 20% of the population of the state of Israel are Arab Palestinians, and although nominally equal, they are in fact discriminated against in a racist manner in all walks of life. This is something that is part of the transformation that Israeli society needs to undergo. We need to have complete equality within Israel. And by that I mean not only civil equality to Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel as individuals, as persons, but also national equality, to recognize the Arab Palestinian population within the state of Israel as a national minority and to grant it collective rights. And this will have effect on cultural life in Israel, on the education system in Israel, even on the symbols of the country, on the flag, for example, on the national hymn, for example. The country needs to truly make all of its citizens feel at home. Currently, behind the debate around the Jewish character of Israel, there stands a very awful truth. The current state of Israel looks upon those of its citizens who are not Jewish, and it tells them, this is not your home, this is not your state. At the same time, it looks upon Jewish people at various parts of the world who are not citizens of Israel, and it tells them, we are your state. And this is a paradox that needs to be untangled. And this is part of the transformation that the Israeli society needs to undergo. And these two great changes, these two dramatic, radical changes both the change in the character of the Israeli state towards an egalitarian state, a state that practices equality towards its citizens, both Arab and Jewish, and at the same time, the transformation of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict into an Israeli-Palestinian peace along the lines that I've outlined. I think that these two processes are interconnected, and by struggling for the one, we are also struggling for the other, and these are two paths that we need to travel at the same time.
There's a lot of food for thought here, and each one of these topics could be a separate, we could have a separate discussion just on those, so you brought up a lot of food for thought. We have some of our viewers are asking about, one asks, is religion a factor in the conflict? To what extent is it a factor, and how can that be changed if it is? And maybe you want to comment briefly on that. What is the role of religion in this conflict?
Very briefly, I don't think the conflict is a religious conflict. A conflict is between the national aspirations of the Palestinian people for self-determination, aspirations that are not met because of the ongoing Israeli occupation. There's a lot of religious rhetoric, but this need not conceal the fact that the question is the question of national self-determination for the Palestinian people. There are some movements, political movements, both among the Palestinians, for example, Hamas and Islamic Jihad, that speak in the name of religion, like there are some political parties in Israel, including the ruling coalition government, that speak in the name of religion, but we need not let the religious rhetoric conceal the national character of the conflict. And for national conflicts, we have solutions. We have the principle of self-determination.
You describe yourself, originally when we publicized this event, we described you as an anti-war activist, and you told us that you prefer to call yourself a peace activist.
Yeah, that's true.
What's the difference, and why do you say that? Why is it that distinction important?
For me, the distinction is important. Perhaps in the U.S. the two terms are used interchangeably, but at least here in Israel, I feel that this distinction is important. Ever since the Oslo process collapsed in October of the year 2000, the word peace had gained bad reputation. Not only because Israeli right-wing and centrist politicians have used the word peace in order to conceal their policies of maintaining the occupation, but also because some activists on the left and on the radical left, peace activists who have spent a lot of years struggling against the occupation, no longer felt that there is hope for a peaceful solution, for a diplomatic solution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Their focus had shifted rather to struggling against the manifestation of oppression, against the day-to-day oppression of the Palestinian people. Whenever there's a war, naturally they go out and demonstrate, and so on and so on. But the lack of usage of the word peace is, for me, a sign of a lack of perspective for a solution to the situation in which we are now. So I insist on using the word peace activist rather than anti-occupation activist or anti-war activist, saying not only that I oppose the unjust wars, the wars of aggression that the Israeli government is initiating, like I do, and not only do I struggle to end the occupation of the Palestinian people, which I do, but I also have a program, a vision, a hope that I try to suggest to the Israeli public opinion. There won't be any peace, and the occupation will not end until the majority of Israelis will want such a solution. Will think that such a solution is not only an altruistic move in order to help the Palestinian, but also is in accordance with their own national interest, which we think it does. We think that a just Israeli-Palestinian peace is in the interest of the people in Israel also. So by using the word peace and by insisting on calling ourselves a peace-seeking party and organizing peace demonstration and being peace activists, it's a sign the hope that we are trying to offer to our society, to the Israeli society.
One of our viewers wants to know if you think there are some profound lessons to be drawn from the lives and the politics of Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. in our country, who both confronted and eventually vanquished powerful forces and structures of oppression and inequality, and also had that kind of vision that you're talking about. Do you think that those two figures offer some lessons for your work, for the work of progressive and peace advocates?
Well, the 20th century is full of lessons, and it's full of historical figures that we can admire and draw strength from and draw inspiration from. And Martin Luther King Jr. is definitely one of them. I don't consider myself a pacifist, so at least in this respect, I differ from the tradition that Gandhi has pursued. But the 20th century is indeed full of lessons. We learned not only from Martin Luther King how to struggle for against racism and for civil equality. We have learned this lesson in dozens of countries. We have learned not only from Gandhi how to struggle for national liberation in India. We also have the experience of Nelson Mandela and the ANC in South Africa. We have the experience of Fidel and Che in Cuba. We have a rich history of progressive struggles that we can learn from, and we need to see what kind of values and visions we can take from that history and apply to our situation. Of course, our situation is different from other situations. Like the Cuban situation is different from the South African, and the US situation is different from the Indian. But values and visions sometimes transcend peculiarities and concrete situations. So we need to take these values and see how we apply them in our peculiar situation, our concrete reality.
Well, I think we're reaching the end of our time, and I think our moderator is going to jump in here. But I just want to end my part of it by mentioning one of our viewers asks, he says, well, there seems to be some momentum now towards our country, the United States, seeing at least there seems to be some thinking here that maybe there needs to be a change in our approach, in the U.S. approach. I don't think it's reached the level of the White House and the Congress yet, but there seems to be some momentum, and how do we maintain and build that momentum? So I think to wind up my participation, I think that's our responsibility to think about the issues that Uri has raised and how we can take the thinking that he's presented and help to build a broad movement in our own country that can help bring about peace in between the Israelis and Palestinians, and a just peace, and move forward with a positive vision and in a positive direction. So, Terry, I'll turn it back to you.
Well, thank you, Sue, so much, and a big thank you to Uri for a wonderful educational hangout, and thank you to the viewers and the really interesting and thought-provoking questions also asked. This is recorded, and therefore you can go to YouTube and get a link, share it with your friends, share it with your family. This is intended to help educate us, help activate us as Americans to speak out, call our congresspeople, call our senators, tell them that we demand a just and peaceful resolution, a viable two-state solution for the Palestinian and Israeli peoples, and that we're tired of our tax dollars going to killing civilians and children, and that has to end, as well as U.S.-based corporations like Caterpillar, who profit from the occupation. So with that, it's our hour is done. Please share this recording, and another big thank you to our guest Uri Weltmann and to our interviewer Susan Webb. And thank you for joining us. This is peoplesworld.org, and please visit our website. Take care.